Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Meighan. I'm a PhD graduate in Educational Studies at McGill University and Social Media Subcommittee Leader for the AAAL Graduate Student Council. It is a pleasure and a delight today to welcome you all to the first of our 2022-2023 AAAL Graduate Student Council YouTube Speaker Series. And today, it is a pleasure to welcome Dr. Suresh Canagarajah here today. And I'll just introduce a little bit more about Dr. Canagarajah. Dr. Canagarajah is a Sri Lankan Tamil scholar in the fields of social linguistics, literacy, and English language teaching. He is currently the Edwin Earl Sparks Professor of Applied Linguistics, English, and Asian Studies at Pennsylvania State University. He is best known for introducing orientations to language and education from traditions and practices in the Global South to diversify dominant norms and policies in higher education and academia. He has played a leading role in empirically studying, theorizing, and defining the notion of translingual practice, which looks at a way of introducing communication as exceeding bounded languages and involving a negotiation of diverse semiotic repertoires, including words, multimodal resources, objects and artifacts, and material structures. He treats this ecological, ethical, and inclusive orientation to speaking and writing as part of his South Asian heritage and ancient practices in the Global South, which were later suppressed by European colonization. So a warm, very warm welcome to you, Dr. Canagarajah, and we really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today. So I thank you and express my gratitude to you on behalf of the AAAL graduate students. And yes, we have some questions here. Yeah.
No, it's a pleasure talking to all of you, to you individually, and also to the rest of the graduate student community.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much. And we did have some questions that the steering committee and subcommittee members we put together. So we have 6 questions, and please feel free to elaborate as much as you would like. So this video will probably be around about 7 to 10 minutes long. And the topic is multilingualism from the Global South. So my first question, Dr. Canagarajah, I'll just bring them up for you, is what is language for you and what does it mean to language?
Right. So I'm glad that the second part of the question, you made it a verb, because what does it mean to language? Because that's a definition that I find difficult sometimes to communicate to my students and colleagues in the United States. So I do think of language as an activity. It's a way of doing communication. And when I say that, I also mean that it's a way of looking at communication as beyond just the grammatical structure or the static language system, but it is something more dynamic, in the sense that in communication, we draw from a lot of different semiotic resources. It could be multiple languages. It could be a lot of embodied resources like our skin color, our appearance, our dress, and a lot of resources in our environment. You know, the fact that we are speaking by Zoom shapes our communication in a lot of ways. The things we can talk about and the things we can demonstrate. So language as an activity enables me to include all of them. But I think the focus for me, because language is an activity, is always practices, strategies of communicating. How do I respond to an interlocutor? How do I construct my thoughts in an article with the knowledge that somebody else is going to be interacting with me from the other side as a reader? And also this text is going to be moving across a lot of different lands and historical periods. So that, again, the fact that to language is to adopt particular strategies, I find it difficult sometimes to communicate in the United States because everything I do, eventually people turn it into an abstract grammatical system. So to be to illustrate, when we talk about translanguaging or translingual practice, I actually give the word translingual practice for my book because I want to emphasize that. But I still find a lot of people thinking about it as a norm, a grammatical system, a type of language. So I'm kind of asking a lot of people to move beyond thinking about it as a system, but it's a practice, it's an activity. It's about how do you do language.
Yes, fantastic. Thank you for that, Dr. Canagarajah. And I completely agree. And I like the way you stress the practice element, the embodied part of communication. And it's not just about a system. I really appreciate that. And you give great examples there of what that means for you. And I really like that notion and idea of translingual practice. Thank you. Our next question. It's a little bit longer, I would say, than the first one. Do you think there should be kairos for translanguaging practices? For instance, a particular moment in a particular rhetorical situation where translanguaging is necessary and productive and appropriate? If yes, could you give us some examples of such kairotic moments? If not, why?
Right, that's a great question. I've never encountered applied linguists posing a question like that because a lot of people in a lot of my allied field, the English department, especially in rhetoric and composition, use the word kairos a lot, but I haven't seen a lot of applied linguists using it. So I totally agree. Any communicative strategy or practice is kairotic because it's about what is relevant, what is strategic for my interests, for my identity at any given moment. But I would also include the space as well, not only time, but in what context, meaning both space and time. So for example, when am I saying something, and also where am I saying it? So I go back to I'll give you a couple of examples from my writing life. But I like to just quickly also acknowledge how Homi Bhabha's hybridity is sometimes misunderstood. People again make hybridity into a thing, a product. It's an identity. Look, I have a hybrid identity. But what he takes pains to argue that it's actually a strategy, and a strategy in a particular given moment or time, a strategy where the speaker or communicator wants to have an advantage, or wants to have an edge in the communication. That is when maybe in a context when there is English only as the dominant norm, I bring some words from Tamil or some words from Hindi to gain some leverage in the communication and kind of disturb the dominant ideology and also introduce a side of me that might be important for the communication. So that is another example, or another scholar who thinks about hybridity, which is related to a lot of people think about it in relation to translanguaging, but both of them have something about the moment. So let me just illustrate that when I started writing academic publications, I was a little cautious. It's a kind of a humbling experience. Basically this example of how I've been progressing in my radicalism in discourse over time, partly because it had to be kairotic. It had to be shaped by where I'm writing, when I'm writing. So when I came originally to the United States around the mid-1990s, early 1990s, there was very little conversation about disturbing the English monolingual norm. Pennycook's, let me see, Philipson's linguistic imperialism had just come in the late 80s. No, I think it's even 1990. His book was 1990. So it was just around that time. And I'm here in 1993, 94. And then my identity, I'm from Sri Lanka. So if I do anything unusual, people are going to say, this guy doesn't know the academic norms, especially in anonymous publishing, peer reviewing. They don't know where this is coming from, and they're going to assume that I just don't know how to write. So I was very cautious, and the only thing I did at that time was to bring a different discourse. So I wasn't messing around with grammar, trying to bring Sri Lankanisms or even use our first language Tamil, but bringing more narrative, personal writing into the more impersonal genre. But as time went on, partly because maybe we started a process of opening up the dominant discourse for other voices, now I am able to use Tamil words, written in the Tamil script in some of my academic publications, with enough clues, signals for readers to understand what's going on. So the writing has now kind of evolved in time to doing more bold, risky things. So it's a kind of a issue of time. I would say even within the text, sometimes we need to choose where to bring our voices and ideologies in a renowned way. So I recently published a book, Transnational Literacy, or Translingual Literacy in Transnational Life. And I'm embarrassed, I'm misstating the title. But what I did was, I start with certain cautious moves, like using Tamil with a little bit of, with almost immediate translation. But once the readers are used to what's going on and figure out there's a strategy here, and I become more bold. So the final chapter, I just have a whole chapter title in Tamil without any translation. And then they have to read through for a couple of paragraphs to figure out what's going on. So even within the text, sometimes there are kairotic moments in the sense of figuring out what is going to be strategic, disturbing, but also creative in different times. So I totally believe this is actually a good question, because a lot of people ask, people, not just me, but any scholar, progressive scholar, and ask, okay, if you believe that academic language is so monolithic and privileged and ideological, why are you not resisting it? Why are you using academic English? So I think the answer is there's a time and space for what we do, and I think the other thing is you cannot speak without voice. So I also believe that everything we do is translingual and has voice, except that it's hard to detect them because they are very subtle. It might be very modest, but we cannot expect everybody to do everything we want in every communicative act. So I think in defense of progressive scholars, we have to say they're also choosing where to bring out their alternative discourses and alternative styles of writing, depending on the context.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Canagarajah. There's some excellent examples there of how we can disturb those monolingual norms and hegemonies and drawing on translingual practices like you have just given. And I love the way you talked about bringing in Sri Lankan and Tamil in the book example, where the final chapter was written in Tamil, but based on how you had kind of structured and written it. So I love that, and I like the way you kind of call for those kairotic moments as strategic, disturbing, and creative, and that everyone has a voice in all of those translingual moments. So thank you very much for drawing our attention to that and those communicative strategies that you mentioned. So thank you. Our next question. How could translingualism and translanguaging be helpful in promoting linguistic equity for multilingual learners?
Right. Yeah, that's an important question. It has become more important now in the context of anti-racist struggles, diversity issues. In your question, did you mean translingual writers or just, I'm sorry, multilingual writers, or regardless
Yes.
of writing or speaking, everything? Multilingual
Yeah.
subjects?
I think the question that was posed was multilingual learners. So it wasn't
Learners.
specific.
Perfect. No
Yeah.
worries. Yeah. That's great. I just want to see that I'm inclusive in the sense of the particular practice we are talking about. So there are many ways to think about why translingual practice can be empowering, and to begin with, even disturbing for dominant ideologies, and make a space for different languages, different voices. So at the most micro level, I actually love saying that English is a translingual language, or English is a Creole language, even make it worse, more unceremonious to talk about English. And it's a fact, that English has absorbed words from so many languages, structures from so many languages over time. And the idea that English is a separate language, it has its own system, it's a pure language, is an ideological construct. It's a thing that native speakers believe, and sometimes we all believe because we are made to accept that point of view. So at the very basic, I try to make students aware that all languages, if we think of them as an activity, involve multiple resources. And what is kind of disturbing for them is to learn that what we consider language itself has many resources from so many different languages, so many other backgrounds, and we shouldn't be afraid of diversity. I would also maybe add to that by saying, I tell a lot of my students, diversity is the norm. Homogeneity or purity is a construct. It's artificial. Of course, we know it's a fact of life. You'll get punished for deviating from norms, and we respect that, and we need to be strategic. But at the very base, if we get a chance to use some big words, we can say ontologically, what's real, what's out there, or a set of resources, a lot of semiotic resources out there, and it's over time, historically, sociologically, politically, that certain resources get sedimented and formulated, codified into something called the standard language. So for a lot of students, it's kind of unnerving to learn it in the beginning, to see that even our languages, what we consider as first language, is made up of so many different resources. But then to make them comfortable about bringing their languages when we learn English is a second strategy I adopt. That is to say, we have this conversation all the time about the traditional understanding that L1 will distort L2 learning, right? So I tell them, no, you don't need to be afraid of that. Languages go together, they help each other, they become part of the communicative activity. So to bring their own languages into the classroom is something that I encourage. And then the big question, of course, is how to be strategic in bringing our languages into the conversation or into writing, especially in spaces that are defined as English only. So I'll conclude with a kind of a question that always comes up when I teach writing. I was teaching writing in City University of New York before I came here. And why that context is special is they have a 50-minute writing test at the very end of the first year learning of writing. And it's an unknown topic, and you just come to the room, sit and write this essay as soon as it is given to you. So it's still there, I think. That's the way they assess writing. So students always come and tell me, what's the point of doing all these things you are doing in the classroom, like bringing all the other languages, being creative, being critical, reading so many multilingual authors, exploring different creative genres. So I kind of figured out over time. Initially, it was, of course, a little, it was a disturbing question because they said, "I just want to pass this test." Yeah, you write 5 paragraphs in standard English. So what I told them is, okay, that is one genre of writing. It's a genre that you never use outside this particular institutional context, because in real life, nobody asks you to sit for 50 minutes and gives you a topic and say, right, or you're punished. Right? So, and also the genre, even in a police station, if they make you sit and write a confession, it's going to be a different genre. So what I told him at the same time is, all good writers can change their writing strategy, to different genres. And if you kind of play around with these other languages, other genres, it doesn't take away your sensitivity to this normative context, these prescribed genres like text. It actually makes you even more aware. It is a simple example of how we learn through contrasts. I tell my students, I'm still learning English because I actively use Tamil in my family. I always ask myself, okay, in Tamil we say like this. Why is it that they say like this in English? There seems to be something unusual here. So I'm always thinking critically, and I'm reflexive about my language use, because I'm moving between different genres and different languages. So that would be a way to help students understand that moving between their languages, bringing their languages and cultures as resources, is not disabling to be successful in mainstream communication or life in the dominant institutions. Of course, you don't necessarily have to subscribe to everything that the dominant ideology says. So, for example, even in order to pass the test, I would say bringing a little bit of extra can actually help you. But, with a full awareness of what these guys want from you. But you don't even know, actually, it's really true that if you write a stereotypical essay with just standard English and just the thesis statement and topic sentence, nobody's going to be happy with that either. They would say, this is a very mechanical writing. So there's a kind of a fine line between knowing the norms, but also bringing something extra. So I think translingual practice can help students do that.
Yes, thank you very much. So, excellent examples there again, and how you express how do we be strategic about this, and you give some great examples of English itself absorbing from so many other languages. It's not a quote unquote pure language, as you correctly point out. So even demystifying that process for students can be, in a sense, enable more equitable practice, because, like you pointed out, you're encouraging them to bring in their own resources and their own languages into the classroom, and at the same time, that critical awareness and being strategic about, well, this is what's required for the exam or test or whatever it may be, but it's not necessarily representative of reality, let's say, and to encourage that process of, this is what they want, but you can, and I like the way you said, bringing that extra there, and translingual practice can do that, and that's how you give great examples of that. So thank you for those wonderful examples. So the next question we have, it kind of follows on, I guess, because we've been talking about writing practices a little bit as well. The next question is, do you think writing knowledge can be carried over from one language system to another language system? If yes, what could be some suggested approaches to studying this phenomenon of transfer?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, that comes up all the time when I teach and report from my teaching, because sometimes I use literacy narratives as a genre. I love the genre because it's personal to some degree, where students talk about, how did I evolve as a multilingual and multiliterate person. But as they write, they also reflect on their trajectories and even also the conflicts that they have faced in their life being multilingual. Actually, one of my colleagues, Karen Johnson, who is a expert, world's well-known expert on teacher development, uses narrative as a reflective learning process for teachers. So she has nothing to do with, with people like me in rhetoric and composition or teaching or writing, but she finds value in that genre. So it's a kind of a preface to say that what we carry over as a genre, as writing skills or writing norms is something different from just grammar or structures, because that's where the problem comes. People ask me if you're writing a narrative in the classroom, it's not relevant to the other genres people do, and leave alone the English class. It's, if you take physics or geography, their genres are different. So I would start from the basic assumption that no genre can be carried over anywhere else. Even the writing we do in a classroom will change. Say, for example, in the basic English writing class that you teach will have a different mix of ecological conditions, different students, different readings, different instructors, even myself, our identities are different. So they might position themselves, the students, to you in one way, and then to me in another different way. So even within basic writing, you can't carry over or transfer the skills of grammars or structures from one class to the other. I'm basically saying that it's almost like Heraclitus said, you can't step into the same river twice. There is no rhetorical situation that's the same either, because the audience is different, the resources are different, identities in different time and space, coming back to the kairotic, are changing all of us. So, but what I teach is dispositions and practices. Because what I tell students is, this genre you're not going to carry anywhere else, but the way we negotiate this genre for voice is developing in you certain attitudes, certain dispositions, or like what you might say, a habitus that can help you to navigate other rhetorical and writing challenges when you are in a different context, a different instructor, different subject. These dispositions are things that would come into play in order to negotiate that particular situation. Along the same lines, strategies. We were talking earlier about my kairotic strategies of writing. When I was a novice scholar, I adopted certain strategies. Now that I'm a senior scholar, I'm a little bold and risk-taking. So those strategies can also help. The only big question is, a lot of people say, okay, so what are the dispositions? What are the strategies? And what I tell them is, we need to learn more of them, because all these years we've been asking the wrong questions. We've been looking at what's the grammar I should teach? What is the writing structure I should teach? And we've expended so much money, so much time in figuring out these norms in a very product-oriented way, the norms of writing, the norms of speaking. But we haven't been asking this other question: what dispositions are developing in learners? And what are maybe strategic, resourceful dispositions that can help people as they move from one context to another? So I like to think of transfer as not genres, structures, grammatical norms, but dispositions, which would carry you through into, another reason why we need to think like that is communicative practices, communicative genres are changing very dramatically all the time in the context of globalization, digital media. There are new genres that nobody can teach any of us. Because like yesterday in our university, we had a workshop for our graduate students on how to write a DEI statement and how to write a teaching philosophy, because they are applying for jobs. A lot of you are probably doing as graduate students. And what we found was, as faculty members, we are unable to help our students because we didn't do them when we were applying for jobs. It's a new requirement. So what we thought was, it's hard for us to help our students meaningfully. So let's have a workshop and get an institute in our university which deals with questions like that. So here again, these are new genres all the time that we can't teach, but the dispositions might create, attitudes like observing things carefully, being strategic, knowing the norms, but also bringing your voice, being mindful of the audience and the context and the chaotic moment, just as you are also concerned about your voice. So those are kind of dispositions that can carry over for a longer time.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you so much. I love that. And those examples, I think it's great that you stressed this kind of fluidity and dynamism that exists. And there's always new genres coming up. And the great example you gave of the teaching philosophy and the EDI, and I'm sure many viewers, graduate students, are familiar with these as well. And I think that's a good thing to remember, and I love the notion and the concept of dispositions, as opposed to focusing too much on structures or grammatical systems, let's say, but focusing more on dispositions. Or when you were talking, what came to me was having a toolkit, or becoming more able to adapt, and encouraging that flexibility to adapt to the fluidity of transnational contexts, of globalization, and all of these things. So I think that's wonderful, and so much many great things that you've identified there, and excellent examples. Thank you. Our next question, Dr. Canagarajah, and I think we have 2 more questions for you, so thank you again for your time. The next question is, what recommendations do you have? And this might tie into your other suggestions that you've given. What recommendations do you have for implementing translanguaging in multilingual writing classes?
Yeah, I guess some of them came up in my examples from the classroom. So in order to kind of pull them all together as a kind of way to remind what underlies all these things, I would say 3 words. For me, teaching is ecological, meaning that I don't restrict my teaching to just my syllabus, the reading that I give them, or me as a teacher. But I say the classroom and things beyond the classroom have a lot of resources. So it's a question of how do you provide the space for learning, which is open, or even better, invites all these different resources there. So I remind students that, and also give them activities which encourage them to bring these influences from around them. As we mentioned, even their first languages, I would encourage them to bring it. The second word I would use is dialogical. And what I mean is I encourage the students to interact with themselves and treat myself as also a person who is not kind of just judging them or giving them knowledge, but engaging with them. So, what that means is that in writing classrooms, we always circulate essays, drafts, multiple drafts. I use the web a lot, where you can easily post ongoing drafts and create spaces in the classroom for students to read each other's work, and myself read their work, to give them very gentle questions that push them on in the lines they choose, not to turn them back into some other orientation. So dialogical, in the sense, also is a nice word from Bakhtin and others, that we learn through, and even Vygotsky, we learn through activity. And then the third thing I might say is a teacher as a facilitator. That is, I'm there to create a context where with resources that students find useful, and resources that can help them to move forward, but also tailored individually to what the students are doing. So as the student writes, I might find that for the particular topic they are choosing, there's a writer or a text that helps them pursue that topic further. So I think to put all this, I think I should also say my pedagogy, I like to use the word soft assembly. And what I mean is it's not rigid. Maybe people might fault me for not being too structured. But at the same time, it doesn't mean there's nothing in the sense that you go to a classroom without any plan. I have a plan, but it's soft in its assembly because I say we're going to now work this together. Now as students and I work on their drafts, we're going to figure out what's the most strategic direction. At the same time, I'm open for some students who are very cautious and they don't want to be too experimental because it's their investment in the writing project, in the language, etc. So that might give you some understanding of what's behind the examples I gave earlier.
Yes, that's wonderful and very helpful as well. And I like the way you stress the teaching being ecological, dialogical, and the role of the teacher as a facilitator. It was really coming to my mind that kind of co-construction of knowledge and while languaging as well. And like you said very well, that you encourage your students to bring their languages to the classroom and all the strengths that entails, and then to share drafts. I think that's a wonderful way to enable a more equitable learning space in general. So thank you for that. And our last question is, how do multilingual or translingual practices differ in the global North and the global South?
Right. Yeah, this has been coming up recently in a lot of places where people have been wondering about the knowledge we produce and discuss from different communities. So what I would say is, going back to what we said is ontological about languages and communication. Communication, whether it's in the global North or South, is made up of a lot of semiotic resources, embodied resources, that are part of our environment, and something that goes beyond just separate languages, whether it's the global North or South. But what is different is a lot of different language ideologies we have had in history, with which whether acknowledge it or not. And that makes a lot of difference for practice, in the sense when you have a language ideology that says there are pure languages and we need to respect them, or languages are associated with particular communities and native speakers, and therefore native speakers have the authority to tell us how to use the language, then it's going to shape social practice that way. That is, people are going to be scared of deviations and not be too creative, not bring their own voices. So I would say in the global South, there has been a lot more recognition of languages as part of the environment, as languages as part of the land. And I would also, in addition to embodiment, use the word relationality, how all these things work together and shape each other. So both our bodies, our objects, different semiotic resources, different languages, there's been a greater tolerance for seeing them work together. So I would say in Sri Lanka, when we were growing up, we would code switch into English and Tamil all the time. And we didn't think of it as unusual. I joke with my students and say, actually, code switching is easy for me. It's using pure English that's hard for me, because that was never a part of our life. And vice versa, using Tamil was also a pure Tamil. It's also difficult for us because we always use both languages together. So we grew up in a practice where languages were always mixed with a lot of other semiotic resources. There's an interesting word in sociolinguistics, code switching or translanguaging. I might even say translanguaging as an unmarked code. And what it means is it's nothing special. We just do it all the time. That's the normal condition. It's actually trying to be pure and careful is what is more difficult for us. So that language ideology maybe prepares people in the global South for translanguaging in their life in particular ways, whereas in the global north, and here again it's a recent ideology from about 17th century Europe that languages are separate, they are pure, they belong to the native speaker, which took hold over time in recent history, modern history. So because of that, there are differences in practices where people are still struggling to bring their own languages in, or even worse, people might say, this is a new practice, this is novel, or this is, strange, or even we are doing something brave and, colorful, because it's kind of a new practice here. Or I mean, new practice in the sense ideologically, it's something they are recognizing as different. I think I should also bring in the word misrecognition, ideological misrecognition here, where in the global north, they haven't seen the type of practices they always had. So because of that, this is made to look like a novel experience. But anyway, I should say that people understand translingualism very differently in the global north for all these reasons. And the danger is that some of our scholars here in the United States or in Europe who don't know anything about the global south, translingualism gets distorted in so many different ways. So as I said, for some people, translingualism is a novel, postmodern experience. And there again, the word superdiversity, which a lot of European scholars coined as to index something new about their diverse life of diversity. And translingualism gets kind of collapsed with that. And people say, okay, they think of all these things as new. So that's one distortion, I would say, coming from the global south. Secondly, a lot of even progressive scholars sometimes think of translingualism as a product. So there have been a lot of criticisms from my good friends in applied linguistics who don't agree with translingualism, and they say it doesn't do anything for power because it's a new norm, it's a new orthodoxy, and therefore it's something that's that becomes a dominant way of talking, regardless of all the diversity that needs to be promoted. So I think the mistake there is, as I mentioned in the very beginning of the interview, that we think of language as a practice. In the global north, they think of it as a product. And unfortunately, progressive scholars are also interpreting translanguaging not as a practice, but as a new norm. And therefore, it takes away the edge. But going back to what I said about Homi Bhabha and others, it's a strategy. It's a kairotic strategy. It's about what you do when. It's not a way of talking or a set of grammatical resources or even language resources. For a lot of people, it's like put English and Chinese together and you get translingualism, right? So which is not the idea. That's just a way of making a new product, right? So that is the second misunderstanding. And the third misunderstanding, or rather distortion, is how educational institutions and industries are exploiting translingualism for their purpose. So they make it something that is required and not really the practices that disturb, but they would make it look like creative writing or creative language use that would profit selling of products, marketing of one's identity as somebody who is, learned and diverse and creative. So it's also being used in the global north by a lot of industries and educational institutions as kind of a new way of presenting yourself, a new identity. So, but we have to always go back to the critical edge that translingualism has for in the global south, where for communities there, I should also say a lot of communities don't use the word translanguaging or translingualism. They would have a lot of local words to use them. And this is a kind of a necessary evil where we need to sometimes use shared labels, shared words in order to talk to each other, because, in order to develop knowledge together, in order to have a conversation together. But then it risks the danger of being misunderstood as something that's going on in the global south. So, global north. But we have to go back to some of the critical perspectives from indigenous communities, knowledge from the global south, where this kind of translingual life is a strategy, a practice for kairotic moments, where you want to have an edge in the conversation, something that could elicit for you a more empowering identity and more egalitarian, inclusive social interests for everybody.
Yes, excellent there, and a really clear identification of those distortions. And I like that word that you use as well, and very clear distinctions between language being viewed as practice, everyday practice in global south settings, as opposed to language being viewed as a product in the global north. And you do a fantastic job of identifying the dangers of that. And I like also the way you stress the is framed or can be framed as something new or novel, when in fact it's not in many global south situations, context settings, where and I like the word you use, relationality, and the language ideologies, the difference there of how language is viewed, or languaging is viewed in the global north in comparison to the global south. So thank you so much, Dr. Canagarajah. That is all of our questions that we had from our student members. And I just would like again to take the opportunity to thank you for your time today and for sharing your expertise and your knowledge with us. This is fantastic, and I'm sure many of us will get a lot from this video, from our interview today. So thank you.